Years ago, there was an episode of the sitcom The Big Bang Theory, in which one of the characters, who is obsessed with Indiana Jones, makes his new girlfriend watch Raiders of the Lost Ark with him. At the end, he eagerly asks her what she thought, to which she responds, "It was very entertaining, despite the glaring story problem." She points out that in spite of the elaborate plot, the film would have turned out exactly the same if Indiana Jones had done nothing. He does lots of heroic things, but ultimately the plot doesn't make him the hero he might appear to be. Either way, the Nazis would find the Ark and die. Indiana Jones plays no role in the outcome of the movie. The sitcom characters spend the rest of the episode trying to find a way around this by some hole in the plot to no avail. We'll come back to this analogy. The hero of Iain McGilchrist's magnum opus, The Matter with Things, is a grand theory about the two hemispheres of the brain. In a work of immense erudition and ambitious scale, McGilchrist builds a case from a combination of broad and exhaustive neuroscience research, philosophy, and even religion to argue that the distinction between the two hemispheres of the brain, rather than being a cliché we have moved on from, represents a fundamental distinction between two kinds of thinking and attention. He argues that the hemispheres show distinct differences, have distinct purposes, and that a shift in the emphasis of one over the other has come to shape almost all of the problems that afflict modern society. His conclusion is that the left hemisphere can be thought of as bitty, fragmented, categorical, rational thinking, and the right deals with broad-scale context, meaning, metaphor, and so on. The left hemisphere's mode of attention is grasping. Your dominant hand is controlled by your left hemisphere, while the right attends more intuitively, the left thinks explicitly, the right implicitly, the left is analytical and context-deprived, and the right is open and holistic. In McGilchrist's view, the right hemisphere should be dominant, and the left should work for the right, rather like, as his first book was titled, A Master and His Emissary. This is where his theory gets ambitious. According to McGilchrist, in the modern Western world, the left hemisphere has come to subordinate the right, rather like an emissary taking over when the master is away, who doesn't truly understand how to be in charge, and the result is the chaos of the modern world: bad thinking, anger, hyper-rationality, bureaucracy, materialism, even atheism. The matter with things in the modern world can be understood by looking at the brain. I warn you, when you've read this book, you will for some time be unable to stop seeing the world and even yourself through this lens. At the very least, the metaphor itself is absolutely brilliant. It puts into context why things like certain kinds of rationality or scientism are deprived of perspective, why materialism seems rationally appealing but fails to account for consciousness. It puts things like angry social media behavior into context when people are deprived of intuitive social perspectives, engaging in bitty, angry linguistic interactions. If you read this book, you will find it hard to not start seeing things as left hemisphere-y or right hemisphere-y. Since this is a review, I should start with a basic overview. The book is in 2 huge volumes which look like textbooks, and it is broken up into chapters on specific topics, each of which could be its own mini-book. While that seems daunting, it is incredibly readable. The subjects are diverse, but also follow a clear trajectory. They each stand alone sufficiently that you could pick it up and read anyone. The first volume deals with the bulk of the neuroscience and looks at the value of science itself. The second moves into more philosophy and metaphysics, considering time, consciousness, and finally, in a chapter he was apparently warned by colleagues to leave out, a lengthy consideration of religion, theology, and the sacred. Besides being readable, the book is also quite dippable. I've had these books in a pile for a few years now, and I keep rereading parts of them idly and finding myself engrossed. I should say at the outset that, obviously, I am not qualified to review the merits of the book in terms of its scientific validity. My general reading on others' evaluations of it is that the conclusion is something like, kind of but not really, in that it seems to be slightly suggested by more skeptical reviewers that McGilchrist overeggs differences that aren't quite as straightforward. The brain is not just 2 hemispheres, but each hemisphere is composed of various systems, all of which are mirrored across the hemispheres. and it seems rational to suggest that perhaps any statements of the left does this and the right does this will already lack nuance. However, McGilchrist does acknowledge this and argues that the system level matters as much, if not more, and there is no doubt that his evidence is extraordinarily exhaustive. But there is a very strange tension present in this entire work. The book is simultaneously incredibly detailed and researched, and at the same time kind of simplistic. Neuroscientist Robert Sapolsky once said of the Hemispheres idea before this book was published, albeit slightly mockingly, that left brain Edness has the connotation of anal retentive bean counting, and right brain Edness is about making mandalas and singing with whales. And physician and neuroscientist Raymond Tallis said in a review that McGilchrist's book always lead back to his twin obsessions with the naughty left hemisphere, that arrogant know-nothing know-all, and the saintly right hemisphere. The argument itself is not so simple. He begins by arguing that over evolutionary time the corpus callosum, the band of fibers that connects the two brain hemispheres together, has evolved due to the increasing of the brain's size. As brains have evolved to be bigger, the corpus callosum has got smaller, to be less about communication and more about inhabitation, controlling what is sent between the hemispheres rather than enabling their interaction, thus producing a greater divergence in their operation. He argues this has happened evolutionarily out of a need for two forms of attention, distinguishing food and grasping for it, and at the same time having a vigilant attention to the world lest you be eaten while you are eating. Attention more broadly, as he emphasizes, and the kind of attention that we give to the world, is fundamental to our reality and generates it. As he puts it, attention is a moral act. As an aside, this chapter on attention made me think of Simone Weil. Attention, taken to its highest degree, is the same thing as prayer. It presupposes faith and love. Absolutely unmixed attention is prayer. It seems, then, that the two hemispheres attend to the world very differently. He argues from case studies of damage to the right hemisphere that the concentrated attention of the left hemisphere does not house the capacity to attend to what it is not directly attending to. In other words, when it is not directly attending to something as far as the LH is concerned, it does not exist. As far as your left hemisphere is concerned, what it no longer attends to is not just unseen, but ceases to exist. This means that the right hemisphere has a greater relationship to our sense of time and the persistence of the world. The right seems to deal with multiple spatial dimensions, the left a flat and schematic world. Patients with right hemisphere damage seem to represent the world as flattened, abstract, and schematic. A similar pattern is true with perception. Damage in the RH seems to produce warping and distortions. I'm simplifying a dense chapter here. Almost all extraordinary distortions of reality follow from right hemisphere damage. More than this, not just hallucinations and misperceptions, but delusions, distortions of judgment and belief. McGilchrist says that if the left hemisphere is not frankly deluded, it is clearly at sea, and the right hemisphere is its reliable anchor in reality. All of these chapters make a fairly substantial case that the left hemisphere is dependent on the right to essentially stay coherently within reality. In the extreme cases where the RH is seriously damaged, the world suddenly looks deluded, distorted, and lacking in any contextual reality or sustained attention in a way that the RH does not, if the left is damaged. However, most of the evidence does seem to come primarily from patients with damage, which may be inevitable given that we are generally limited to such evidence besides just scanning the brain, but it strikes me as a partial picture. If you have two rowers in a small boat, each at an oar, and one stops, it seems like the other is purposefully rowing in one direction because that's where the boat goes. That doesn't mean that the other is just trying to go that way. It just means that is what happens when the other part of the operation is stopped. The point is, just because the LH lacks judgment or produces distortions without the RH, that doesn't tell you that that is something essential about its functioning, rather that it requires something from the RH in order to function properly. I'm not saying here McGilchrist's evidence isn't solid. It seems clear to me the basic fact that the RH provides a baseline of context is quite clearly established, but it is hard to say or for me to say again, a complete layman, that studies of damage exactly tell you what the LH is doing in a fully healthy brain, or exactly how much we can project back from a damaged brain to a healthy one. There is already an assumption in this interpretation of the evidence that the hemispheres are separate things, and if you damage one, you see what the other is really like, which you can miss, is something that itself has to be proved as well. In other words, only a healthy brain can tell you how a healthy brain functions for certain. This will be important later on in this review. There is also a chapter on autism and schizophrenia, which is fascinating, hard to summarize without butchering it, but also somewhat tangential it seems, while the argument is that both show RH abnormalities. The extent to which that gives us evidence as to its function is open-ended. Most interesting are schizophrenia patients, which is significant to McGilchrist's extension of the hypothesis to his view of the modern world. As he says in the summary, Western modernity has many overlapping features with the phenomenology of schizophrenia. Whatever its contribution to the argument, if this chapter was a book on its own, it would be worth reading. In the second half of the book, things get much more broad. McGilchrist moves essentially from discussing evidence for his thesis to its implications, discussing everything from epistemology to time, consciousness, and religion in a set of chapters on each of which could stand alone as its own book. For anyone partial to musing on such subjects, they are fantastically readable, broad in scope, and completely absorbing. To do a massive disservice to a huge range of chapters, which if it isn't clear by now I think you should definitely read, and give a sweeping summary of all of this. Essentially, the implicit holistic understanding of the right hemisphere gives us a richer, more contextual, intuitive, and importantly truer access to reality. The discussions of the subjects are unquestionably fruitful and interesting, and their degrees of relation to the hemisphere hypothesis varies. At times, he is simply discussing the subjects. More often, though, it is a specific discussion of how each hemisphere does or might approach what is being discussed. Here I begin to have some issues. The first is that we are now to some degree extending the hemisphere model to a kind of metaphor, especially when we are talking more broadly about collective thinking. The second is that, as I mentioned previously about the assumptions made, by working with the idea that damage to one hemisphere and the resulting effect tells you what the other hemisphere is doing most of the time, which means we are working on assumptions about what it really means to say the left hemisphere would think one thing, given that in a healthy patient, they are never actually isolated. There are some obvious questions. How does a healthy brain think more with one hemisphere than the other? What specifically triggers our employment of one more than the other? And more importantly, and perhaps most significantly, who is it that is thinking with one hemisphere or the other? McGilchrist includes a genuinely interesting chapter on matter and consciousness, but the discussion is mostly about consciousness in the abstract rather than this grounded question about who the thinker in my mind is and how it relates to his hypothesis. The repeated reference to the left hemisphere thinks this, and the right hemisphere's view of so-and-so is this, ignores the fact that consciousness is a singular experience, and the brain is, as much as it may be divided, operating as a whole. You begin to feel throughout this second half that an assumption is being overwritten that is not exactly fully justified and that doesn't entirely make sense. I do think it is reasonable to infer that damage to one hemisphere means that the behavior, attention, perception, and thought patterns that follow can tell us about the opposite hemisphere. But does that also tell us that in a healthy brain, the hemispheres are functionally independent and can be seen through this separately personified dynamic? Surely both are always working together, and for McGilchrist's thesis to be shown, it would require more evidence that, say, a materialist is specifically lateralizing more to their left hemisphere than a panpsychist. The more you attempt to apply the idea to things like, well, ideas, or beliefs, philosophies, etc., the more it becomes a kind of metaphor rather than a scientific proposition about how we are employing our brains. In this metaphor there are two entities, left brain and right brain, and you, the person thinking. So which am I? McGilchrist implies that the left hemispheres might be a reductionist, but people who are reductionists also have right hemispheres, not to mention the theory itself is reductionist. There is a kind of circular reasoning involved in its application, a danger of exactly the kind of simplicity Sapolsky talked about, almost a kind of left hemisphere equals sign bad bureaucratic things I don't agree with, right hemisphere equals sign Wordsworth skipping in a meadow. McGilchrist is clear in his introduction that he is not being so simplistic, but the simplicity is hard to avoid when being applied liberally and at large. You can't help but feel that the science breaks down into an analogy or a metaphor, a very fruitful one that absolutely illuminates a lot of the subjects and definitely adds to the discussion of all of them brilliantly, but something that doesn't quite have the wings McGilchrist believes it does. This is where I would return to the Big Bang Theory. Lurking over the second half seems to me is a problem of exactly the same kind as Sheldon's girlfriend notices with the movie. If tomorrow, all the neuroscience presented by McGilchrist turned out to be wrong, many of the arguments in the latter half of the book would be perfectly legitimate. Weirdly, all the neuroscience becomes kind of irrelevant. After all, McGilchrist does not present a cause or a solution at the level of neuroscience. In other words, what caused us to start becoming more inclined to materialism or whatever it might be? Is it brain pathology, or is it caused by factors at a level of history and society? If the latter, the brain analogy is moot. Is it actually even possible to think consciously with one hemisphere or the other? Again, how can you prove that one kind of thinking is actually a specific left hemisphere kind of thinking? Brain-damaged RH patients don't all become reductionist materialists. So how can we say anything really is left hemisphere thinking, except by way of an analogy or an association with something that is ultimately arbitrary? The movie is great, but Indiana Jones doesn't change the outcome. But I do want to stress this: the metaphor is actually brilliant. Perhaps the failing of McGilchrist's fully putting together how the LH and the RH can be somehow independent and also be you, how you can employ them and be them at the same time, or how as a society we are a brain at large in some metaphorical sense, is a failing that reflects how little we are actually capable of knowing, or how many mysterious remain about who we are. The idea that we need more context, more implicit, holistic thinking, more art, more belief in value, less reductionism, more serious religion and less dogmatism, less atheism and more openness to the givenness of reality, more poetry and less spreadsheets, more human interaction and less bitty informational exchanges. These are all things that he argues for, passionately, eruditely and brilliantly, and that I wholeheartedly agree with. Not only that, but challenging and rethinking the importance of attention in shaping your reality is another insight I feel this book gives, something that can be applied to so many things. Even as the hemisphere theory may break down, the recognition that you are your brain does not, and the fact that you can make more conscious the way you are applying your attention as something not just functional but that shapes the way you see the world is something valuable to be reminded of. We are our brains, as peculiar as it is to try and think about. So I have no idea if the hemisphere hypothesis McGilchrist so comprehensively presents will turn out to be validated as neuroscience continues to make progress. But many of his insights can and should be absorbed into our collective thinking. Indiana Jones may not have saved us from the Nazis, but he still has an awful lot to say. You should definitely put the time into reading this fantastic seminal book.